Welcome to Kelly Corrigan Wonders. I'm Kelly Corrigan, and today I'm wondering about the specific marriage of person with job. In other words, when an individual with his unique background and perspectives commits to a task, how does his story and his insights and his areas of highest compassion make hard incremental work possible? My conversation partner is Pete Buttigieg. Part consultant, part small city mayor, part a whole lot of other things. And the work before him is every mode of transportation in America. So join me for a conversation about one man's ability to increase mobility, literally and figuratively, for all of us. This is Kelly Corrigan Wonders. Welcome back to Kelly Corrigan Wonders. I'm Kelly Corrigan, a veteran, a Christian, a gay man, a Rhodes Scholar, a McKinsey consultant, a mayor, the only child of academics, a minivan-loving father of 2 toddlers, a beer-drinking, wood-splitting Midwesterner, and, I saw on Instagram the other day, an Iron Man. That is a partial profile of the man running transportation in America. Transportation that defines the set of choices we have. What school we can go to, what park we can play in, what factory, warehouse, or office building we can reach in time for the starting bell. Not to mention how easy or hard it is to get to our ailing mother or that job interview that could change our lives. It turns out social mobility depends on actual mobility. Pete Buttigieg is trying to put more in reach for more Americans. Because if you can get where you're going, you can put yourself right where you want to be. Here's my conversation with infrastructure nerd, bridge builder, piano player, and the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. Hi. So great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
So we're doing this 10-part series on what it takes to make it in America today. And I wondered if you could give us the long answer to this question. What is the relationship between transportation and a person's ability to flourish?
Well, part of what I think most of us feel makes America America is the idea that you should be able to prosper no matter where you come from. Mm-hmm. We know that there have been a lot of obstacles between that American dream and the lived reality of a lot of people, but that's the dream, that's the idea. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what I think we are responsible for helping to make possible when you work in public policy. And a big part of that is transportation. There's an intimate connection between social mobility, economic mobility, and actual mobility.
Yeah.
The capacity to get to where you need to be.
I think about commutes as like the most obvious example of like you can only get the jobs that are in this radius from where you live.
Right. I mean, your opportunities not only for jobs, but for education, for participating in society, from being part of a faith community or a sports team to just a network of friends or extended family that supports you. All of that depends on your ability to get around. And for some people, your range of motion is infinite. It's literally global. For other people, it can be very difficult just to get where you need to be within the boundaries of your own community. One of my first trips as secretary provided an example I think about a lot. We're in Chicago, where we're helping to expand the Red Line to the south side of Chicago. And one of the things that I learned about on the ground there was a neighborhood called Roseland. And that neighborhood, within the city limits of Chicago, of Roseland on the far south side, if you don't have a car, it can take you almost an hour and a half to get to downtown where a lot of the jobs are. Mm-hmm. The reason that example stuck in my mind so much is that there is a very small town called Roseland right next to South Bend, Indiana, where I grew up, 90 miles east of Chicago. And if you do have a car, it takes about an hour and a half to get from there to downtown Chicago.
Right. So and how many miles is it in Chicago?
I mean, we're talking within the city limits.
Right.
So yeah, 90 miles, 90 minutes, or, I'm sure less than 5 miles, 90 minutes. And that shows you some of the disparities that people face.
And then you're just stuck. And your whole, I think there's an interesting relationship between
transportation and imagination and inspiration.
Absolutely.
And to the extent that you never get to leave your tiny pocket, you're just going to have a different quality of imagination.
Your exposure to the world, your exposure to opportunity, your exposure to other people and ideas, all of that depends on the access you have to transportation. And by the way, so does some very basic questions of affordability. One thing we're starting to do a better job of in the policy world is understanding how transportation and housing costs fit together. They already have been well understood to fit together in any family's budget. I think they fit together in the views of a lot of local governments. Historically, that's been less true at the federal level, although we now work across the organization chart of the executive branch to do a better job of integrating that. Because you encounter so many people who either live in a place they can't really afford in order to be close to work, or they live impossibly far away from work in order to be somewhere they can afford. We can do things about that. And part of that's transportation policy, but part of it's being more thoughtful about how the way we build our communities and how the way we connect our communities ought to be related.
Yeah. What's a complete street?
I would define a complete street as a place where all of the different uses of a streetscape, from the sidewalk through the curb into the street, can coexist peacefully. In other words, where you can have buses, cars, maybe trucks, and also pedestrians and bicycles and wheelchairs and small businesses and sidewalk cafes, if you're in that part of a community, that they can all fit together. There was a period when I think America got so excited about the extraordinary potential of highway engineering that we began to lapse into this idea that the only purpose of a road or a street is to zip traffic through it as quickly as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And while that might be appropriate on a freeway, although even then, speed needs to be balanced against safety, in the heart of a community, it can be devastating. My hometown of South Bend had its most vibrant and important downtown main streets converted sometime in the 60s or 70s into basically a pair of one-way highways. And one of the best things we were able to get done back when I was mayor was to reorient that into a complete street approach, slow down traffic a bit, but a very reasonable amount, in order to reopen a sense of life where it was the kind of street you would want to not only drive on, but walk on the sidewalk or even sit at a restaurant or a pub. And that really helped bring the life of our downtown back. So a complete street is safer, it's more economically vibrant, and it's more appropriate to the context of the community it's in than a lot of the street and road designs that our generation has inherited.
Yeah. So you brought up safety a few times. I think that you have a $145 billion budget, and I think $60 billion of it goes to roads. And I think that's where all the heart of the safety problem lives. And it's more or less the same number of people dying on the roads as are dying through gun violence.
That's right.
Whereas with flights, there are years where we have 16 million flights and 0 fatalities.
That's right.
What is the strategy?
Well, our strategy has 5 elements. Safer roads.
I should have known that you would have like a strategy with 5 elements.
Well, I mean, this is one of the most important things we work on, and it doesn't get enough attention. As you pointed out, flight, a mode of travel that involves soaring through the air.
It's incredible.
Miles above the surface of the ground. Most years, we have 0 passenger fatalities on airlines. We're actually up in arms when the number of close calls, sometimes defined as an aircraft coming within about a mile of another aircraft when it's not supposed to, even that gets us up in arms, rightly. Railroading, the number of accidental deaths in railroading, we're pushing that towards 0. It's in the single digits. And yet every single day, more than 100 people lose their lives on America's roads. I actually think it's because it happens so much that we're a little bit inured to it. We think of it as just normal. Not only is it as large a cause of death in the US roughly as gun violence, it also is something where you see a lot of disparity between what happens in the US and in other developed countries.
I wanted to ask you about that. Like, do you have a go-to comp that's doing it so well that we could be learning from?
Well, no two places are alike, but you certainly see a lot of built-up cities, especially in Western Europe, that have lower fatality rates. And importantly, you see that in the US too. Part of what I'm trying to do as we work toward a vision of 0 is remind people that this has been achieved. Obviously not nationwide,
Right.
but there are communities, and not tiny ones. We're talking places of 50,000 people or so. Hoboken, New Jersey, Jersey City, New Jersey, Edina, Minnesota, Evanston, Illinois, all very different in terms of their land use and their structure, that have had at least 1 year of 0 deaths. Which brings me back to that strategy I was mentioning. So safer roads, because the design of our roads matters. Safer speeds. Safer people, which includes drivers, but everybody who interacts with the road system. Those 3 elements are each things that we can and do a lot of investment on here at the department. Safer vehicles.
When you talk about people, do you mean people driving with cell phones or people driving after drinking? Or?
Yes. We've come a long way in terms of people using seatbelts. Still not 100%,
Yes.
but it's a huge difference maker, and we've come a long way. We've come a long way in terms of impaired driving, just culturally.
Yeah.
Drunk driving was so much more acceptable 10 or 20 or 40 years ago. But we've entered into this period where the way we relate to tech, I mean, all of us have seen it. If you're driving, somebody's a little in and out of their lane, you look over and they look like they're watching a movie or checking their email, who knows? But doing something you should not be doing when your vehicle is in motion. So distracted driving has become a huge concern. There's also a lot of complexity in terms of how the onboard technology in cars works.
Oh.
We're going through, I think, a vulnerable period where we don't even completely know. So, for example, a lot of cars have technologies that nudge you back into your lane if you
Yeah.
drift out of it. That's a good thing. Cruise control that actually notices if you're getting too close to the car in front of you.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. But they're so helpful that can actually lull you into not paying attention.
Yeah,
which
it's
is
like
why
a moral hazard, right?
Yeah, and some of the newest technology actually is to check your eyes to see if you're paying attention. Newer car models, a lot of them will do this. So it's one set of technologies to protect you from depending too much on the other set of technologies, which is why I do think we're in a very much kind of one step forward, one step back season. But eventually, there is a lot of hope that these technologies will be part of the answer to how we dramatically cut roadway deaths in this country.
It's so common that people believe in this ability to compartmentalize. I don't really. I feel like everybody takes their whole selves wherever they go. You have such an interesting profile, sort of original for us. And I wondered if you could talk about the ways that these 4 things affect your policy making. So 1 is being a small city mayor. 2 is being a veteran. 3 is being a Christian. And 4 is being a gay man. So can you go one by one and tell us how you think they help you make better policy or see different solutions or coordinate and collaborate?
I'll try.
Okay.
Well, certainly being a mayor, I think a mayor's eye view, when you go on to do anything else in public service, really stays with you. Because when you're a mayor, especially in a smaller community where people come and find you, you go grocery shopping and you get an earful about what's going on with trash pickup or the streets. First of all, you're reminded every day the whole point of public service, which is to solve problems and make everyday life easier. And it helped me develop a philosophy of public service, which is that the most basic things are connected to the meaning of life. Not because you necessarily find meaning in working on them, although people like me do, but because whatever you find meaning in your life, you're better able to have a meaningful life if you're not worried about whether there's a road to get to where you're going, or whether your trash got picked up, or whether your water's safe to drink. And I think that philosophy of public service is very important to bring with you into some of these heady spaces around Washington where partisanship and ideology tend to take over if you let them.
It sort of reminds me of the Daniel Kahneman Thinking Fast and Slow stuff, where we think that being laid up for 6 months would be terrible and that having a janky knee would be much preferable. But the fact is that having a janky knee, having a janky road to drive on, having a bus that never runs on time is actually more impactful in terms of our daily satisfaction than these more catastrophic events.
Yeah, that stuff builds up.
Yeah.
And if your experience...
Like death by 1,000 cuts, kind of.
Yeah. If your experience all day is things just a little harder, a little more expensive, a little bit more frustrating, a little bit less predictable, over time the weight of that accumulates and then seeps into your ability to be a present, loving parent, or to pay attention to your studies if you're a student, or to do whatever it is, whether it's entrepreneurship or faith, whatever it is that makes life meaningful to you.
Right.
So our job is to tear down some of those barriers. So I guess that would be my short answer on how being a mayor affects. Obviously, there's a lot of transportation policy work we did too, but writ large, that's how I think about it.
How about being in Afghanistan?
Well, one thing I got out of being in Afghanistan was the ability to very quickly form very deep connections of trust with people that I barely knew, or barely knew at first, and people who had radically different backgrounds than me in terms of where they were from or their political values, racial, regional, you name it. And part of my job, a big part of my job actually was driving. In order to, for my commander to go outside the wire, it was usually necessary for me to come along. And sometimes I would have to put together a little crew to take equipment or people on the road between Kabul and Bagram. And when we were all getting ready to get into the vehicle, nobody cared if I was going home to a girlfriend or a boyfriend or what party I belonged to. It was, do you know what you're doing? Can I trust you to keep your eyes on the road? Have you looked at the threat reporting from last night? And so even though all we had in common was sometimes the flag on our shoulder, it felt like that was all it took for us to be able to trust and work together. And I try to bring that spirit to work in the civilian world. I'd like to see more of that spirit prevail in Washington.
Yeah.
And it affects everything that I do.
How about being a Christian?
Well, let me preface this by saying when you're in public service, you make sure that any decision you make is appropriate to people who share your faith or don't, people of any faith or of no faith. But of course it affects my understanding of, first of all, what I was put on this earth to do, and the idea that you're supposed to order your steps toward the service of others and making yourself useful to others, and that what is particularly worthy is to be there to either support or defend those who have less, those who have less means, those who have less power, those who have less social acceptance in the world, especially in terms of the New Testament. That is, if you believe in the doctrine of the imitation of Christ, which is an important part of my faith tradition, then a lot of that is to try to imitate that spirit of cutting across social norms and cutting across hierarchies of wealth and power to just help people who need help.
Yeah, the least of my brother.
Exactly.
What about being gay?
I would maybe append to that being a dad, a gay married father of toddlers, a boy and a girl.
Penelope and Gus, good names.
Penelope and Gus, and they have taken over our world, Chaston, my husband, and I. Still in some ways, I think, don't know what hit us ever since we got the call. They're right in that 2 zone. They're coming up on 2.
God bless you.
And it's a handful, and it's the best, hardest thing we've ever done.
Yeah.
And, we're mindful that our family is different than most, but also it's like a lot of families, and every family is different in some way, and just wants to be able to look after itself and be supported. So I think about that a lot. I think a lot about how policy can either get out of people's way or make it harder for people. And I think about, frankly, my experience, and I know this hasn't been everyone's experience by far in that alphabet of LGBTQ that I'm part of. But my experience in some ways has validated the possibility of change and growth in American politics too.
Absolutely.
Because, as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, when I was thinking about public service in a serious way and entering the military, I was in a society where I could literally get fired from my job in the military for being who I was. And, the other thing that was part of my career was, public service in Indiana. The idea that I could reach a higher level there, let alone do something like run for president or serve in a president's cabinet, was not only off, but would have been considered ridiculous. And now we're in a totally different place. So I've lived that growth in this country, even while seeing how much further we have to go and how much further so many others who don't yet have equality. But it's shown me what's possible. And I think about that a lot too, and in a way that's hopeful, but also scary. Because of the moment we're in.
Yeah. Hope's so important.
Yeah, I
mean, you really have to believe that it can get done.
I don't think you can do anything in civic or political life.
Yeah.
If you're not propelled by some measure of hope.
Is it harder and harder to gin up hope? Like once you see how the sausage is made, as they say?
I do think being an unusually young mayor probably benefited me because there were things I didn't know about how hard certain things are supposed to be.
Yeah.
And now I'm on the one hand, a little more grizzled by that time. And on the
you're
other hand,
41, Pete.
Also an unusually young person to be doing what I'm doing. So, there are times, and anytime you try to do something hard, and certainly something hard in U.S. national policy, you experience all the reasons why there's frustration with the process, there's frustration with this town of Washington, and that frustration is well earned and well deserved. On the other hand, you can see things get done. One of the best bits of advice I got on my way out here was a passing remark made by someone who worked with me when I was in South Bend. He was our public works director at one time. And he said, you're going to Washington, you're going to be a trim rudder on a super tanker. And that's how it feels sometimes. That here in this office, we're in a department of 55,000 people in a huge administration. And we can move the rudder a little bit here. And a lot of very big things move, but they don't always move very quickly. Of course, our job in this moment where President Biden has charged this department and me with delivering this piece of an Invest in America agenda is that there is a sense of urgency, and we need to move swiftly to get projects delivered, not just for the projects themselves, but because building good things well will, in my view, and I think the president's view, lead to a higher level of actually trust and cohesion in our society. From people who have seen far too many policy failures in our lifetime.
I mean, it sort of goes back. It sort of goes back to what we were saying about the Daniel Kahneman stuff, which is that maybe the greatest advertisement for democracy is that our society would work really well in a nuts and bolts infrastructure kind of way, like that it would be the best place to live.
And this is really contested. There is an idea going around that if you're in a model like the model in China, which doesn't bother with things like democratic participation or environmental reviews as we think of them, or certain things that we would consider basic to the rule of law, that it's more efficient. Command and control is more efficient. There's that idea being put on the table, which we have to very much resist with the idea that our messy democratic process is ultimately better. It yields better and more durable results. There's one of the most recent times in modern history when democracy was called into question, even in respectable circles in the US, the 30s. Fascism had a certain sense of appeal. I don't think it's accidental that the excuse that was always made for Mussolini was, he's a rough guy, but he makes the trains run on time. By the way, not true. But I think it's really telling that it was a transportation example that was used. This idea that, okay, there are these things, maybe there's some ugliness in your government, but it will deliver for you. We got to show that a democratic, inclusive, participatory process that respects people's rights also delivers better than command and control. That's part of what's at stake here.
That's a tall order.
It is, but we've been given a lot to work with. I mean, when you are handed, in the case of our department, the better half of about $1 trillion, we've got roughly half of the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that needs to flow through the machinery of this department and get things done for people, from just good old-fashioned fixing a bridge to programs of a type that didn't even exist before, like investing in resilience for areas where roads are going to get washed out annually because of climate change has made a supposedly 1,000-year storm into an almost annual event. Or electric vehicle charging networks, not something people were thinking about in Eisenhower days. Preparing for commercial space travel. I mean, the stuff we're doing right now is once in a generation. And so we'd better have once in a generation ambitions for the difference that it's going to make. And that will be hard because we're making up for lost time here, a lot of underinvestment for decades. But I also think this is our chance to do that, to build confidence. And when you build confidence and use those tax resources well, then you have a little bit more trust to continue to try to do big things in a public fashion. So you touched on climate change. How does that change the Department of Transportation's to-do list? Well, in two ways. One, it's part of the problem, and transportation actually represents the the biggest sector in our economy, if you count it up by greenhouse gas emissions, transportation puts in the most. So to me, that means if you work in transportation, your aspiration should be to deliver the biggest parts of the solution. And some parts of transportation are harder to decarbonize than others. EVs alone are going to be a big challenge, but maritime, aviation, even more difficult. But we can get it done. So there's transportation as an area that needs to change as part of the solution. And then there's transportation as an area that is vulnerable to the problem. I mean, we've seen runways buckle in unprecedented heat. We've seen, against some roads that just shouldn't be where they used to be because the climate has switched on them. I've seen where in Colorado a combination of a drought and then a flood along with a wildfire led to mudslides that took out a very important part of our supply chains.
It snowed in LA.
These things shouldn't be happening, but they are. And of course that affects our transportation. So we have to both protect our transportation systems from the effects of climate change, and we have to modernize our transportation systems so that they're part of the solution. There's one other layer across this that I think is actually very exciting, which is I think transportation is perhaps the best area where we get to break the old false choice between doing the right thing on climate and growing the economy. There used to be this idea of climate versus jobs. Nowhere is it clearer than in transportation that climate jobs are a huge part of the future. I've been on construction sites of EV battery facilities in places like DeSoto, Kansas, and Glendale, Kentucky, that dwarf what was the biggest auto facility I had ever seen growing up, which was the giant and empty Studebaker factory that dominated the skyline of downtown South Bend. That was 800,000 square feet, and it powered an entire region. This is millions of square feet. Each one of these two factories I just mentioned, 4,000 good-paying jobs, a lot of them where you can make six figures without even having a college degree.
Yeah, it's huge.
That is a big deal and a big opportunity and a big area of competition between us and countries like China. Working to edge us out in the automotive world racing toward electric. So I mentioned that as just one example of where climate represents a challenge in terms of decarbonizing transportation, a challenge in terms of protecting our transportation systems from what's already happening, but also an enormous opportunity that we are now very much seeing the early gains from when it comes to our economy.
How does AI factor into what's possible? I mean, we know like the basic hedging on AI, everybody says the same thing, that, it could be a disaster, but it could solve the biggest problems that have ever been solved. When you look at it specifically related to your to-do list.
So I think the honest answer is we don't know yet, but it means a lot for transportation. About a year ago, I remember becoming obsessed with DALL-E, that program that draws pictures out of a prompt. I just posted something about it on my personal Twitter account. And a bunch of people replied saying, shut up and talk about transportation. And my thought was, I don't know all the ways this is going to affect transportation, but it clearly is. Right. We know some of the ways it will. The automation, of course, of a lot of our vehicle transportation is in its infancy. And again, creates the potential for economic disruption, but also the potential to generate a lot of jobs. It also, and I think the most important part of this by far, it has the potential, if realized, to dramatically change the safety story of our roadways. And in a country that's losing 40,000 people a year to roadway deaths, there is the potential, again, it's not automatic and we got to make sure it unfolds the right way, but it's at least theoretically possible that AI could be part of how we get to a future where being killed by a driver will seem as quaint and old-fashioned as we would think today in America, losing your life to cholera or tuberculosis. Just a thing of the past that was once kind of scourge of everybody's existence. That's possible.
Do you have a specific way in which that's possible? Like, can you paint a picture for us?
Well, look, the basic challenge, of course, is to make sure that automatic driver assistance systems, what are called ADAS, or automatic driving systems, those are two different things, but that either or both of them radically change the rate of car crashes, killing drivers, passengers, pedestrians, and cyclists in this country. That, I think, is the central challenge. To me, everything else is important, but extra compared to saving lives. And we have that chance. But here's the other thing about AI or any other technology. we'll never quite see all of the important effects that it'll have coming in advance. If you think about the last decade, where there were a lot of things going on from the early development of what will soon become, I think, widespread use of eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing, in other words, flying cars, or a lot of really interesting things with micro-mobility, scooters. The most important transportation technology of the last decade was the smartphone. It's not even a vehicle, and yet it turned out to matter so much to everything from how you board a plane to how you get a ride. And it just cut both ways, distracted driving, but also a dramatic improvement in a lot of convenience. I think similarly, AI will work in some areas that we're tracking right now, like automated driving, and some areas that we can't even guess. We can think about some. I think AI will probably play an important role in managing the air traffic control of drones, for example, because there's not enough air traffic controllers in the world to handle drones the way we handle airplanes. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's possible.
Right, we can never see it all. We can never see all the ways that things are going to play out.
So what we have to do is just create a framework for these changes to be absorbed in a way that is likely to help more than it hurts. And that's what we do all day here.
Right. What's an example of something that happens through the DOT that the average person would never think of that really makes life better for people?
Oh, interesting. As proud as I am of the infrastructure work where we get to do a ribbon cutting and maybe the president will be there sometimes, the most important work we do is in things that don't happen. It's the prevention of bad outcomes. And that's why we have the safety regulations that we do. It's why we have the personnel that we do, working on everything from air traffic control to hazardous material regulation. And we're always pushing to make it stronger and more effective. So in many ways, and I remind our staff of this all the time, in many ways, we earn our paycheck through things that people don't hear about, don't suffer through, don't read about in the paper. And then when those other ones do happen, our job is to learn from them to make sure they're even more rare. Give you a few examples of this. Our Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration runs programming to make sure people don't unknowingly ship hazardous materials in the mail. Something that happens more often than you would think and can harm or injure anybody from a postal worker to a recipient.
What's like a hazardous material that people would ship?
So, for example, there's a phenomenon of craft nail polish, believe it or not. These are the things
I knew we'd get here.
Right?
Yeah.
That can be an important small business. People on Etsy doing things like this. If you don't know what you're doing, or if you're not aware of this, you could inadvertently be involved without ever thinking of yourself as the sort of person. You think shipping hazardous materials, you think big chemical company, right? We're talking about someone on Etsy who maybe doesn't realize something they put in the mail could be dangerous. Things like that. So that's a corner of the work that we do people probably don't think about. We run one of America's service academies, the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, New York. Merchant Marine is a hugely important part of our economic security. I think most people just don't think about much. But having qualified American mariners, many of whom also are reservists in the military, ready to step up and be there in any kind of emergency that requires us to take a more direct role in the shipment of goods. It's one of those things you don't have to think about until you do.
Right.
And then you're not going to be thinking about anything else. Same as supply chains. When I got this job, supply chain was not a word that most people used at their kitchen table.
And then,
right? Suddenly, because you had this bow wave of container ships coming from China after the factory shutdowns there, and a lot of our systems still gearing up from the darkest days of COVID, there was a question of whether Christmas was going to be canceled.
I totally remember it.
It wasn't, by the way.
I know.
Funny, there weren't as many stories about that as there were about the problem. Thanks largely to the heroic efforts of workers on the ground, processed an all-time record high in terms of goods coming through our ports that year. But it showed you just how much is at stake when something doesn't go quite right.
Right.
And the most important fact about our time in transportation, there's two. One, the incredible opportunity with the infrastructure investments we're making in President Biden's plan. But the other is that if you think about what COVID and other effects have done to our transportation systems, this is the most severe and widespread set of blows to our transportation systems that we've experienced since 9/11, and we're still responding. So dealing with all that everyday work to protect anybody who comes into contact with our transportation systems and to keep them moving, even though we, the federal government, don't own or operate most transportation systems in this country. All of that sits alongside the building that we're doing and adds up to what we do in this department every day.
We have something at Tell Me More called Plus One, where we give our guests a chance to honor somebody who's been instrumental to their well-being or to their thinking. Who is your plus one?
One person who really shaped my understanding of politics and service was Joe Kernan. He passed away recently. He was mayor of South Bend and then eventually governor of Indiana. And I approached him gingerly when I was getting ready or thinking about running for mayor. And he was so generous with his advice, but also very humble. He talked about how so much is outside of your control when you decide to do this. He was shot down over Vietnam and was a prisoner of war. Unlike most houses in South Bend in the fall, he refused to have pumpkins at Halloween because he ate nothing but pumpkin for a while when he was a prisoner of war and didn't care to be reminded of that.
Yeah.
But never puffed himself up as a war hero, or even though he literally was. Made a point every single day of picking up a piece of trash or litter that he saw on the street. It's just part of his daily habit, and doing something to help a veteran. And just had a level of passion and I think a deep understanding of what service, military, political or otherwise, is all about. Yeah. And I think left a great example for a young mayor like me and for a lot of people where I grew up.
Well, here's to Joe Kernan. Happy to honor him.
Amen.
We've had a really interesting thread that's run through all the conversations this fall on the PBS show, which is about the relationship between agency, like your personality or your gumption, and circumstance, dumb luck, and intervention, policy or legislation that personally changed your life. When you look at your own story, what is a bit of personal agency that you can point to that makes you right for the work you do? What is some dumb luck you've had? And what is a bit of intervention that you've benefited from, some public policy or legislation that changed your potential?
Well, there's no shortage of dumb luck in my life, for sure. Starting with just being fortunate to grow up in a loving, great family in a middle-class neighborhood in northern Indiana, where even though there were times growing up I felt out of place, it also made it possible for me to thrive.
Yeah. You're an only child?
Yeah.
How do you like being an only child?
There were times when I would sort of informally recruit other neighborhood kids, I think, to play sibling role in terms of having people to be around, playing outside all the time. But I also, I think, built a strong interior life. I was content with my Legos or my books a lot at the time. Yeah. And I think about that a lot now because it's the opposite environment in our house with our kids, our twin son and daughter, who keep each other engaged, entertained all the time. And the very first thing that happens in the morning, you see it on the monitor when we're debating whether we have to go in there at 5 or 6, is one of them will start chirping, and then there will be a little caucus between them, which is great because it means we don't have to get up quite as early while they're entertaining each other till we can make breakfast and get ready. Yeah. So, a lot of luck has gone into my story.
Did you have great schools?
Yeah. Went to the local Catholic high school, which was great. It might not have been great in terms of the building was kind of falling apart. Yeah. But just great teachers and a good sense of community. Yeah. And I could walk there from my house, which was kind of great.
What about personal agency? Like, what about you?
Probably the biggest thing would be coming home. So that was not an easy or obvious choice. I'd grown up in northern Indiana. It had created a great upbringing for me, but I also kind of got the message in a place that had lost a lot of population and lost a lot of its economic strength that if you want to make something out of yourself, you had to go, you had to get out, which is exactly what I did. Got the chance to study at Harvard. Then I got a scholarship to go to Oxford for 2 years and kept getting further and further from home. And when I came back, it seemed like all the opportunity would be far away too. But I found a job in Chicago that got me kind of back into the Midwest. And at a certain point, while so many of my classmates and peers were getting great jobs with exciting opportunities in alluring world cities, I realized that the place I needed to go was where I came from. And that probably is the most important choice in terms of setting the path for everything that came next.
And what about a piece of legislation or public policy that makes your life possible?
Well, look, the most important thing in my life, my family, my marriage, my household, exists because of a stroke of policy that is less than a decade old. A Supreme Court decision in 2015, reinforced, thankfully, by recent legislation President Biden signed, which was the act that protected our marriage. One which, by the way, was not exactly a slam dunk vote in Congress, even in our times.
We had Neil Katyal on the show. He argued that case in front of the Supreme Court that made gay marriage possible.
I mean, I think this is part of what animates my work in policy. I don't have to use a lot of imagination to believe that decisions that are made by courts and by politicians affect our everyday lives. The most basic fact of my life, the fact of my family, not even the opportunities for my family or the things that make it easier or harder for a family, just its existence was not possible, at least legally speaking, a decade ago where I lived. And now it's the most important thing in my life.
Are you ready for the Tell Me More speed round?
I'll do my best.
Are you ever at a loss for words?
Oh, yeah.
Really? I have not
should see me at
discovered this about you. First concert.
Dave Matthews Band came to South Bend.
You're so young.
Blew me away.
Best live performance you've ever seen?
It was probably them, or maybe Fish. Fish does amazing concerts.
I tell you surprised me there. What was your first paying job?
Dog walking, neighborhood dog walker for neighbors who were leaving town.
What's the last book that blew you away?
The Song of Achilles. It's a novel about, and you'd think like nobody could say anything new about the Iliad or the plot of the Iliad.
And that's your thing, right? Aren't you kind of an Iliad guy?
Yeah, well, my father immigrated from Malta. I'm a creature of the Mediterranean.
I have been to Malta.
Have you really?
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Underrated. So the Song of Achilles retells the story of Achilles from the perspective of his lover, and it is so beautifully rendered. It has the quality that actually the original, I think, Homer has too, which is a quality I really value, which is economy of words. Not a lot of words, the space in between where everything I can't explain it, but it blew me away.
I'm there. If your high school did superlatives, what would you have been most likely to become?
Oh, geez. I think I got most likely to succeed, and they had us like for the yearbook photo, like throwing like piles of money around, which I always thought was funny because I'm definitely not the most financially successful member of my class at St. Joe High School, South Bend, Indiana. But I'm pretty sure that's what we got.
Do you have a favorite celebrity crush?
I've learned not to answer this question because life has taken me to a place where I've run into these people sometimes, and I need that to not be on the record.
What do you wish you had more time to do?
Oh, sleep.
New dad. What's your go-to mantra for hard times?
One of my colleagues often says, the only way out is through. And that's always worth remembering.
Is there anyone you would like to apologize to?
Anybody who ever had to deal with me in middle school, for one thing. Yeah.
What was your middle school MO?
Just none of us are at our best, I think.
I agree.
We're all finding our way.
I agree. What's something big you've been wrong about?
Well, I was wrong about the pace of the adoption of automation in transportation. When I was a mayor, in the middle of the last decade, I was chairing a task force that worked on the assumption that, or was kind of advised, that we would have widespread use of automated vehicles by now. And we don't.
Yeah. If your mother wrote a book about you, what would it be called?
Oh, probably something like, I love you, now go clean your room.
If you could say 4 words to anyone, who would you address and what would you say?
Probably younger me who might need to hear it's going to be okay.
Just such a joy to be with you. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Here are my takeaways from my conversation with Pete Buttigieg. Number 1, small, daily, unpredictable indignities quickly build to exhausting barriers. Number 2, The most important recent advancement in transportation is the smartphone. Number 3, Mussolini did not make the trains run on time. Number 4, may we all find ways to be useful to one another. Number 5, the dream of America is that you would be able to prosper no matter where you come from. And that prosperity often depends on highways and transit systems. Number 6, you cannot accomplish anything in civic or political life if you are not propelled by at least some measure of hope that you can believe in, hope that feels rational at some level. Number 7, working in Washington can feel a little bit like being a trim rudder on a supertanker. Things move, but it happens very slowly. Number 8, nowhere is it clearer than in transportation that climate jobs are a huge part of the future. Number 9, Pete Buttigieg doesn't have to leverage a lot of imagination to believe that decisions made by courts and politicians affect our everyday lives. The most basic fact of his life, the fact of his family, was not legally possible a decade ago. And number 10, once-in-a-generation plans require once-in-a-generation ambition. Thank you so much to Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Thanks also to AmeriHealth Caritas, PBS,